There's a child in every dysfunctional family who becomes the emotional repository for everyone else's suffering. They're the one who senses when mom is sad before she says a word, the one who can feel dad's anger building from across the house, the one who absorbs siblings' anxieties, manages family tensions, and somehow becomes responsible for emotional weather they didn't create and can't control. And if you think this is just being sensitive or empathetic, the neuroscience reveals something far more disturbing. Certain children's brains literally rewire themselves to prioritize others' emotional states over their own, creating adults who are so attuned to everyone else's pain that they've lost connection to their own. Today, we're exploring the dark psychology of being the family emotional sponge, and the research shows this isn't a gift. It's a wound that never stops bleeding. Let me start with research that identifies this specific role within family systems. A 2020 study published in Family Process examined what researchers call parentified children, or emotional caretakers, in family dynamics. They found that in approximately 38% of families with high conflict, substance abuse, mental illness, or other dysfunction, one child assumed the role of emotional manager, monitoring and attempting to regulate other family members' emotional states. This wasn't assigned explicitly. It emerged through a complex interaction of the child's temperament, family needs, and systemic dynamics. But here's what's crucial. This role carried measurable psychological and neurological consequences that persisted decades into adulthood. These children developed what researchers called hypervigilant empathy, an overwhelming involuntary attunement to others' emotional states that came at the cost of their own emotional awareness and well-being. Their brain essentially learned that survival meant managing everyone else's feelings, and that learning became hardwired into neural circuitry. Before we go deeper, you need to understand what's happening in a child's developing brain when they become the family's emotional caretaker. Research published in 2019 in Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience used fMRI imaging to examine adults who reported being emotional caretakers in childhood, comparing their brain function to controls. The findings revealed striking differences in multiple neural systems. The anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex, regions involved in processing and feeling others' emotions, showed heightened activation and increased gray matter volume. These individuals had essentially developed enhanced neural machinery for detecting and processing others' emotional states. But simultaneously, they showed reduced activation in regions associated with interoception, the awareness of one's own internal states. Their brain had become specialized for other focus at the expense of self-focus. The study also found altered connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and limbic system. Normally, the prefrontal cortex helps regulate emotional responses from the limbic system. In emotional caretakers, this connectivity showed unusual patterns where the prefrontal cortex was constantly active, suggesting chronic emotional regulation efforts. Even at rest, their brain showed patterns consistent with monitoring and managing emotional information. They couldn't turn off the caretaking, even when alone. Now let's talk about how a child becomes selected for this role, because it's rarely random. A groundbreaking 2018 study published in Development and Psychopathology identified several risk factors. First, temperament played a crucial role. Children who were naturally more sensitive to emotional cues, more empathic, more attuned to social dynamics, were at higher risk. Their natural sensitivity made them effective emotional managers, which reinforced the role. Second, birth order and gender often mattered. Eldest children, particularly eldest daughters, were disproportionately likely to become emotional caretakers. Cultural and family gender expectations often placed emotional labor on female children, but the researchers found exceptions. Sometimes the most emotionally intelligent child, regardless of age or gender, became the caretaker. Sometimes it was the child most attached to the distressed parent. Sometimes it was the child whose own needs were easiest to overlook because they were compliant and self-sufficient. Third, family dysfunction created the need for the role. In healthy families with emotionally regulated parents, children don't need to manage adults' emotions because adults manage their own. But in families with parental mental illness, addiction, trauma, chronic conflict, or emotional immaturity, a vacuum exists. Someone needs to manage the emotional chaos, and when adults can't or won't, a child steps in. Not because they want to, but because the alternative, emotional chaos without management, feels more dangerous. The study used longitudinal data following families over 15 years. Children who became emotional caretakers showed a predictable developmental trajectory. In early childhood, they were often described as easy or mature for their age. By middle childhood, they were managing family tensions, mediating conflicts, comforting distressed parents. By adolescence, they often struggled with anxiety, depression, and difficulty separating from family. In young adulthood, they frequently chose helping professions but struggled with burnout and boundary problems in personal relationships. Let's examine the neuroscience of emotional contagion and why some children are more vulnerable to absorbing others' pain. Research published in 2021 in Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience examined what's called affective resonance, the degree to which one person's emotional state influences another's. They used a paradigm where participants observed others experiencing pain or distress while measuring neural and physiological responses. Individuals who had been childhood emotional caretakers showed dramatically heightened affective resonance. When they observed someone in distress, their amygdala, insula, and anterior cingulate cortex activated as if they themselves were experiencing the distress. They weren't just cognitively understanding that someone was suffering. Their brain was generating the suffering within them. They were literally feeling others' pain in their own nervous system. The researchers measured cortisol and found that exposure to others' distress elevated cortisol in these individuals significantly more than in controls. Their body was treating others' emotional states as their own stressors. This meant that being around distressed people was physiologically taxing, activating stress responses as if they themselves were under threat. Living in a dysfunctional family meant existing in a state of chronic stress, not just from their own experiences, but from absorbing everyone else's distress. A 2020 study published in Emotion examined what happens to a child's own emotional development when they're focused on managing others' emotions. The researchers assessed emotional awareness, emotional expression, and emotional regulation in adults who had been childhood emotional caretakers. The findings revealed a tragic paradox. These individuals were experts at identifying and responding to others' emotions, but struggled profoundly with their own. When asked to identify their own emotional states in various scenarios, they showed significantly more difficulty than controls, often confusing their emotions with what they thought they should feel or what others needed them to feel. When asked to express their own needs or preferences, they frequently couldn't articulate them, having spent so much of their development prioritizing others that they'd never developed a clear sense of their own internal landscape. The study used daily diary methods where participants reported their emotional experiences. Emotional caretakers showed a specific pattern. Their reported emotions were highly reactive to others' emotional states, but showed little connection to their own circumstances. They might report feeling anxious because a family member was struggling, even when their own life was going well. Or they might report feeling fine when objectively stressed because the people around them were okay. Their emotional experience had become so entangled with others that they'd lost the ability to distinguish their own feelings. Research on boundaries provides crucial insight into the long-term consequences. A 2019 study in the Journal of Family Psychology found that childhood emotional caretakers showed severe boundary impairments in adulthood. They struggled to distinguish where their responsibility ended and others began. They took on others' problems as their own. They felt responsible for others' emotional states and failures. They couldn't tolerate others being upset without trying to fix it. Brain imaging revealed that when these individuals encountered someone in distress whom they couldn't help, they showed activation patterns consistent with personal failure and threat. Their brain treated others' unsolved problems as their own failures. This created a compulsion to fix, to help, to caretake, not from genuine generosity, but from a nervous system that couldn't tolerate the distress of not fixing others' pain. The study identified what researchers called empathy without boundaries, where the ability to feel others' emotions exists without the ability to maintain separation between self and other. This led to chronic overextension, burnout, and resentment. The individuals wanted to help, but they also felt trapped by the compulsion to help, unable to choose when to engage and when to preserve their own resources. Let's talk about the specific family dynamics that create and maintain this role. A 2021 study published in Family Systems and Health examined communication patterns in families with an emotional caretaker child. They found several consistent patterns. First, the caretaker child received implicit or explicit messages that they were responsible for family emotional stability. This might be a parent saying, "You're the only one who understands me," or "I don't know what I'd do without you," or "You're so mature," unlike your siblings. Second, the child's own emotional needs were often dismissed or deprioritized with messages like, "You're strong, you can handle it," or "Don't add to my stress right now," or "Be the bigger person." The child learned that their role was to give emotional support, not receive it. Third, the family system often scapegoated or pathologized the child's attempts to have needs or express struggles. If the caretaker child showed distress, they might be accused of being selfish, dramatic, or not supportive enough, reinforcing that their value lay in caretaking, not in being cared for. The researchers observed family interactions and coded emotional exchanges. In families with a caretaker child, emotional support flowed primarily in one direction, from the child to other family members. Even when the child was objectively struggling, family members rarely reciprocated support. The emotional economy was fundamentally imbalanced, with the caretaker child as a perpetual giver and inadequate receiver. Research on the neurobiological costs of chronic empathy provides disturbing insights. A 2020 study in biological psychology measured allostatic load, the cumulative wear and tear on the body from chronic stress, in adults who had been childhood emotional caretakers. They found significantly elevated allostatic load compared to controls, evidenced by dysregulated cortisol patterns, elevated inflammatory markers, cardiovascular changes, and metabolic alterations. The mechanism appears to be that constantly processing and absorbing others' emotional pain keeps the body's stress systems activated. The nervous system doesn't differentiate well between your own stress and stress you're absorbing from others. When you're constantly exposed to family distress, your body responds as if you're constantly under threat. Over years and decades, this chronic activation damages multiple physiological systems. The study found particularly high rates of autoimmune conditions, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and stress-related disorders in this population. The body was literally breaking down under the weight of carrying everyone else's pain. Participants often described feeling physically heavy, exhausted to their bones, depleted in ways that rest didn't restore. This wasn't just metaphor, it was physiology responding to years of overload. Let's examine how this pattern manifests in adult relationships. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships found that childhood emotional caretakers consistently chose relationships where they reprised the caretaking role. They partnered with people who needed fixing, befriended people with chronic problems, entered helping professions where they gave constantly. The familiar dynamic of being needed for their caretaking capacity felt like connection, even though it was actually repetition of a wound. The study identified what researchers called caretaker codependency, where the person's sense of worth and identity became entirely tied to being needed. They felt valuable when helping, managing, fixing. They felt anxious and purposeless when not needed. This created a compulsion to find people to save, problems to solve, pain to absorb. But it also created profound loneliness, because their relationships weren't based on mutual care. They were based on unequal giving. Participants described a painful awareness that people loved what they did, not who they were. They were valued for their function as emotional managers, not for their authentic selves. When they tried to stop caretaking or express their own needs, relationships often ended. The people in their lives weren't equipped or willing to reciprocate care. They'd been attracted to a caretaker, and when the caretaking stopped, so did the relationship. Research on the specific cognitive distortions that maintain this pattern is illuminating. A 2020 study in cognitive therapy and research identified core beliefs common in childhood emotional caretakers. Others' needs are more important than mine. If I don't help, something terrible will happen. My worth depends on being useful. Taking care of myself is selfish. I'm responsible for others' feelings. If someone is upset, I did something wrong. These beliefs operated automatically, outside conscious awareness, driving behavior. The researchers used cognitive restructuring to challenge these beliefs, but found them remarkably resistant to change. The beliefs weren't just thoughts, they were conclusions the brain had drawn during critical developmental periods when the child's survival felt dependent on successfully managing family emotions. Changing them required not just cognitive work, but also repeated experiences of having needs met, receiving care, and surviving others' distress without fixing it. The study found that the most effective interventions involved what they called graduated boundary practice, where individuals slowly learned to tolerate others being upset without intervening. This was excruciating for participants. Their nervous systems screamed danger when they didn't caretake. They experienced intense anxiety, guilt, and physical discomfort. But gradually, with support, they learned that others' emotional experiences weren't their responsibility and that relationships could survive without constant caretaking. Now let's talk about the identity crisis that often occurs when the caretaker stops caretaking. A 2021 qualitative study published in the Journal of Counseling Psychology interviewed adults recovering from childhood emotional caretaking. Participants described a profound identity confusion when they began setting boundaries and reducing caretaking. Without that role, they didn't know who they were. Their entire sense of self had been organized around managing others. Participants described feeling purposeless, empty, lost. They'd spent so long focused on others that they had no idea what they wanted, what brought them joy, what their own goals were. Some described it as waking up at 40 and realizing, I don't know myself at all. The caretaking had consumed so much psychic space that there was little room for authentic self-development. They'd become experts on everyone else and strangers to themselves. The recovery process involved not just stopping caretaking, but also actively building a self that existed independently of that role. This required exploring interests, developing preferences, identifying values, pursuing goals that had nothing to do with helping others. For many, this felt selfish and wrong. Their brain interpreted self-focus as neglect of others. Learning to prioritize themselves required fighting against decades of neural conditioning that said their only value was in service to others. Research on intergenerational transmission shows this pattern often repeats across generations. A 2019 study in Development and Psychopathology found that childhood emotional caretakers often had parents who were themselves childhood emotional caretakers. The pattern transmitted through modeling and through creating family systems that required a child to assume adult emotional responsibilities. The study also found that without intervention, childhood emotional caretakers often raised children who became emotional caretakers, particularly if they themselves hadn't healed from the wound. They unconsciously leaned on their children emotionally, shared adult problems with them, relied on them for support inappropriate to their developmental stage. The cycle repeated, creating generations of people trained to carry pain that wasn't theirs. But the study also identified cycle breakers, individuals who recognized the pattern and actively worked to provide their children with developmentally appropriate emotional boundaries. They sought therapy, learned about parentification, practiced managing their own emotions without burdening their children. The cycle could be broken, but it required conscious, sustained effort against powerful intergenerational patterns. Let's examine the relationship between being an emotional caretaker child and developing mental health disorders. A 2020 meta-analysis published in Clinical Psychology Review analyzed 78 studies on parentification and mental health outcomes. Childhood emotional caretakers showed significantly elevated rates of anxiety disorders, particularly generalized anxiety and social anxiety, depression, complex PTSD, and burnout-related disorders. The mechanisms were multiple. The chronic stress of managing family emotions created vulnerability to anxiety and mood disorders. The suppression of their own needs created depression. The traumatic quality of being responsible for things beyond their control created PTSD symptoms. The chronic overextension created burnout. The blurred boundaries created identity disturbances. The pattern created perfect conditions for multiple forms of psychological suffering. But the meta-analysis also found something important. Severity of outcomes was mediated by acknowledgement and validation. Individuals whose experience as emotional caretakers was recognized and validated, either by someone in their family or later by therapists or others, showed significantly better outcomes than those whose experience remained invisible and unnamed. Being seen in the wound created possibility for healing. Research on physical health consequences parallels the mental health findings. A 2021 longitudinal study published in Health Psychology followed childhood emotional caretakers over 20 years, tracking health outcomes. They found elevated rates of cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disorders, chronic pain conditions, gastrointestinal problems, and premature mortality. The chronic stress of emotional caretaking literally shortened lifespan. The study calculated that being a childhood emotional caretaker was associated with health outcomes equivalent to smoking or obesity in terms of years of life lost. The invisible wound of carrying everyone's pain had visible, measurable effects on physical health and longevity. The body kept the score of all that absorbed pain, all that suppressed need, all that chronic stress, and eventually the bill came due. For those watching who recognize themselves as the child who carried everyone's pain, I need you to hear this. You weren't responsible for your family's emotional well-being. You were a child. Children are supposed to be cared for, not provide care. The adults in your life failed you by placing burdens on you that you weren't developmentally equipped to carry. And the weight of those burdens shaped your brain, your nervous system, your sense of self in ways that continue affecting you today. But I also need you to understand that continuing to carry everyone's pain now is a choice, albeit one driven by deep neural patterns you didn't choose to develop. You're an adult now with agency, and every time you absorb someone else's distress, every time you take responsibility for someone else's emotions, every time you prioritize someone else's needs over your own, you're reinforcing the neural pathways that keep you trapped in the caretaker role. The healing isn't about becoming selfish or uncaring. It's about developing what therapists call compassion with boundaries. You can care about others without carrying their pain. You can be empathetic without being enmeshed. You can help without self-abandoning. But learning this requires fighting against every neural pattern established in childhood that says your value is in your utility to others. This means practicing the most difficult thing imaginable for someone with your history: prioritizing yourself, asking what you need, saying no to others' demands on your emotional resources, letting people be uncomfortable without fixing it, tolerating the guilt and anxiety that arise when you're not caretaking, building a life based on what you want, not what others need from you. It means grieving the childhood you didn't have, where you were protected from adult emotional burdens, where you were allowed to be a child concerned with child things, where your own emotions mattered and were tended to. You needed that and didn't get it, and that loss deserves acknowledgement and mourning. It means recognizing that the people in your life who only value you for your caretaking aren't actually loving you. They're using you. Real love involves reciprocity, mutual care, seeing you as a whole person with needs, not just as a function that meets others' needs. And if setting boundaries causes relationships to end, those relationships were never healthy to begin with. They were transactional arrangements where you gave and others took. The science is clear. Being the child who carries everyone's pain creates lasting alterations in brain function, stress physiology, self-concept, and relationship patterns. But the science also shows that neuroplasticity allows for change. Your brain can learn new patterns. Your nervous system can learn that you're safe even when you're not caretaking. Your sense of self can expand beyond the caretaker role to include the complex, multifaceted person you actually are. But change requires more than understanding. It requires action against every instinct developed in childhood. It requires building a life where your needs matter as much as others. It requires relationships based on mutual care, not one-sided giving. It requires discovering who you are when you're not defined by what you do for others. It requires the radical act of believing you have worth independent of your utility. You spent your childhood carrying pain that wasn't yours. You've spent your adulthood continuing that pattern. The question is, are you ready to put down what was never yours to carry? Because the weight is killing you. The depletion is real. The exhaustion goes bone deep. And continuing to carry everyone else means you'll never have hands free to hold what's actually yours. Your own life, your own dreams, your own joy, your own pain that actually needs feeling and healing. The science shows recovery is possible, but requires sustained effort. You have to become as committed to caring for yourself as you've been to caring for everyone else. You have to practice boundaries until your nervous system stops screaming danger. You have to build an identity beyond caretaking. You have to grieve what you lost and claim what you still can have. The work is hard, but staying in the pattern is harder. One is the pain of growth. The other is the pain of a life unlived, spent carrying weights that were never yours while your own life passes unexamined and unclaimed. The choice is yours.